So how do we actually measure exposure and make sure we're getting it okay? Well, naturally we can use the meter. That's the most traditional way to do it. That's going to move left and right depending on whether we're too bright on the plus side or too dark on the negative side. Um, that's okay, but really, again, that's redundant if we're using auto ISO, because what auto ISO is doing is keeping it right in the middle, no matter what's going on, how the light's changing or how you're changing your other settings. But we can use the meter if we're asking the camera to do something silly. So let's see where I am. I'm at 150 in f8. Let's point at our cyclist here. So here you can see, so we have our max ISO hitting 6400. So if you remember in our settings, that's what we capped at. I'm in my dark basement, so this is fairly dark. We have our cyclist. We're actually close to right on, a third of a stop under. That's cool. That's at a 50th of a second. So obviously we're not going to be able to get a particularly crisp shot with that. If I jump over and try to say, go to my action settings and try to shoot it over a thousandth of a second, there's not much the camera can do. So at this point, we're off the rails in terms of exposure. We're not even on the meter there. If I go fully wide open, it's not going to help. So we're going to have to start dialing it down. So there we can see if I get down to a 250th or so, I can get within a stop. That's probably salvageable within that. But we're still hitting that top level ISO that we set in terms of 6400, and I really don't camera past that. It's just not going to be a great shot. So this is where you need to, one, understand the limits of your camera, and two, understand what you're asking your camera to do in terms of the exposure triangle. Now, a better tool than that is our histograms. So the histogram is a really powerful tool in terms of checking our exposure, because it's a little smarter than the light meter and gives us a better idea. Because you could have something where your light meter is telling you you're okay, but you're actually blowing out your highlights because there's just so much contrast in the scene. So if you're looking at something like with dappled lighting in the woods, and you can get an okay exposure on a subject, but you have some sun coming through in the background, you're likely going to blow that out. And maybe that's okay for what you're trying to do, maybe it's not. But your histogram is going to make sure that you can get an okay exposure. So here, if we go back, we're back at our 150th f8 auto ISO. So our auto ISO it's pushing it, but it's okay. I can go a little bit slower even here and get kind of in a safer realm. But you can see that we're keeping our histogram pretty much in the middle, and that's great because that's where we need to be. If we, for instance, start overexposing, which is going to be really difficult to do down here, but if we start overexposing, one, you do have the live view in your viewfinder, so this is pretty obviously overexposed, but we're going to see that whole histogram shift to the right, and when we start getting those big peaks on the right, like there we go. So that, when we have those huge peaks to the right, even if the rest of our image is more or less in the center, peaks to the right mean that we're losing information because we're blowing some highlights. On the other end of that, if we ask the camera to do something stupid and be just way too dark, obviously we're going to have the opposite effect. We have a histogram that's bunched up way to the left, and that just means our image is way too dark. So we do want to avoid clipping on either side and generally make sure we keep our histogram in the middle. If you're shooting raw, as long as you have your image in the middle of that histogram, you're going to be able to get something out of it in post-production. Obviously, the closer you can get it to where you want it ultimately, the better. But the histogram is great because you can naturally know if you have a bright scene, it's okay to be shifted over to the right as long as you're not blowing your highlights. Whereas the meter is going to try to get that right to that neutral gray, which isn't really what you want. Alternately, if you're at a twilight event, well, most of your image is going to be dark, so that's okay, and you can mentally know, looking at your histogram, that that's okay. So that's where learning how to read the histogram, one, it's going to help save images, but two, it's going to really help you understand when you do want to come in and override that auto ISO, either with changing the ISO itself directly or using our exposure compensation. So if I go ahead and use our exposure compensation here, I can say, you know what, it's nighttime, it should look like nighttime. Let's go a stop and a third under. I can go ahead and just change that, and it's then setting the auto ISO to keep that. And again, we're keeping our image within, kind of within the realm here. we're really not losing anything in terms of shadow. Alternatively, if I'm at a seaside crit and it's okay, we know things are going to be bright, I can really crank beyond that. Not down here because I'm tapped out in my ISO 6400. But I can let it know that I'm okay going a few stops over because I can see it within my histogram that that's there. Also in your histogram, if I grab a shot here, so that was in our live view. If I go ahead and play back, we should have a histogram here as well. So if you do want to chimp some shots and cheat a little bit, one, you're going to see all of your settings. If we have that highlight alert turned on, and maybe I can actually take one where I blow the highlights here as well. Maybe hard down here. But if I go ahead and blow our, we should get, yeah, so we get some blinking there, but we get the white blinking. So obviously that's anything that's overexposed. If you see that on the reflection of a helmet or a little bit of the sky, that's okay. That information's gone. It's going to be pure white. And just know that's where you're at. But if you start seeing that somewhere where you want to save on a jersey, God forbid on a skin, it means you're overexposed and you need to dial it back. So that's our exposure primer. We want to avoid clipping, number one, and we want to use the tools available in our camera to make our lives easier by shooting in manual, but letting the camera do some of the heavy lifting, and then just with these safety nets in terms of keeping our exposure in check.
Wow. Fucking shots being fired all over the place.